Well, I'm excited for this. I'm always excited, but this one I'm really happy to do to bring on Timothy Alberino here to UAP, famous author, explorer, lecturer. Tim, thanks so much for coming on here to UAP. It's a real pleasure to have you.
My pleasure, brother.
Yes, and just for disclosure's sake, because I'm all about disclosure here. I've been really looking forward to trying to have you on the show here for a few years, actually. So I'm glad that we could connect, and I know you're super busy, very busy schedule. So I'm glad that we could connect and make this happen here today. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Absolutely. So I'll just jump right into it then. Some of these questions that I've accumulated over time and kind of following your travels and the things that you've investigated over time. Before we jump into some of that, though, I am curious, how did you kind of get into the subject? Everybody kind of has their own path. Everybody has something that kind of sparked their interest in it. As you were growing up and getting into, exploring and writing your books and everything, what made you get into the UAP topic?
I'm trying to think of the moment that drew me into the topic. I don't think there was a particular moment. I became fascinated with the topic years ago when I was a young man and started, consuming all of the ufological lore I could, and became enthralled really with stories like Bob Lazar, for example. Right. That whole narrative, and then one day, this was probably about, I'm really bad with dates and numbers. This was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 14 years ago. I was lifting weights with my brother-in-law in his basement, and oftentimes the topic of our conversation would revolve around UFOs, the Lazar story, the potential reverse engineered technologies that maybe we've derived from crash retrievals, that sort of thing. I mean, this was very common for us to be talking about that stuff. And on this particular day, he wanted to run over to a GNC store. We were in Cleveland, Ohio, and he wanted to run over to the suburb next door, Brook Park, where I grew up. And it was February. It was cold. It was windy. And to cut a long story short, we had a close encounter with a craft. And it hovered about 40 feet above and in front of my vehicle, so I could see the whole thing out through my windshield, looking up through my windshield, me and my brother-in-law. And I can't speak to the origin of the craft or who was piloting it, but clearly it was employing unconventional technology. It was what I would describe as an advanced aerospace vehicle. There was no noise. It hovered silently in place. It had bizarre triangular lights on the front of it. It had a row of lights, green and blue, around the fuselage, around the bottom. And it was kind of a diamond shape, but it didn't have sharp angles. It had very rounded angles. And it was exotic. And again, I don't know who was piloting it. There was no exhaust. There was no propellers. There was no propulsion system to speak of. The typical silent floating UFO type craft.
Yeah.
And that really just served to concretize the topic in my mind. Previous to that experience, I knew UFOs are real because I lived in Peru for 10 years, and my wife and I would stand on our roof at least on one occasion, and we would watch this. I think it was more than one occasion, but I can remember one specific occasion where we were watching this craft just dart around in the sky, making just impossible maneuvers for conventional craft, just darting around, like a laser pointer up in the sky. Wow. And so I knew UFOs were real, but to have an encounter like that, a close encounter, 40 feet above my vehicle, now that doesn't prove that aliens are real or that the technology comes from non-human intelligence, but it definitely, in my mind, it established the fact that at the very least, we are in possession of what can be described as exotic technology.
Yeah, right. I mean, to have that, close encounter, like you said, 40 feet is a very, very close encounter. And basically to have that realization, someone's piloting this thing. I'm not seeing things. My brother-in-law isn't seeing things. This is happening Was that
Right.
during the day, or was that at nighttime, or
I was at night.
it was at night?
It was in February. It was very, very cold and very, very windy. And this craft seemed to be in its own atmospheric bubble. It wasn't affected by the wind. My car, I had a little Kia Sportage at the time. My car was rocking back and forth. The wind would be, the gusts of wind were so intense, my car would rock.
Wow.
And this craft was completely unaffected by the wind.
I find that really intriguing what you just said there, where it almost seemed like it was in its own protective bubble, because that makes me think of, I believe Eric Davis or Hal Puthoff, or maybe they both said it in the Age of Disclosure film, where they described the physics behind how these things travel. Right. They described it like that they're in this time warp bubble. So you experienced that years before, obviously. You said about 12 to 14 years ago.
We didn't have any time dilation, or missing time, or anything like that, or any adverse effects that I can remember. We didn't get sick or anything like that, and we were pretty close to this thing. So I don't know that it was in a space-time bubble, but certainly was using an unconventional propulsion system at the very least.
That's incredible.
And again, I don't know if it was man-made or what. I mean, it kind of had angular body armor on some of it that looked like it was reminiscent of the Nighthawk, the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, but it didn't have wings. No wings. It had little stubby protrusions, but it didn't have wings. And I'll tell you something interesting. Is I was writing a book, my book called Birthright, and in 2020, sometime in the year 2020, and I had on my screen at the time, I had a reading chair next to my desk, and so here on my screen, I had my book, that I was working on, my manuscript on the word processor, and I had, in a particular chapter of my book, I tell this story that I just told you, and I was in the middle of telling that story, like right in the middle of the paragraph. And occasionally I would take a break from writing and sit down in my reading chair and read, and then come back and write, and then go sit down and read when I got exhausted. And so here, you have to imagine, here on my screen, I have this incident that I'm writing about, right? And you have my what do you call that? Your cursor blinking right there in the middle of the paragraph, telling the story I'm telling you, right? And I go and sit down, and I happen to be reading Hunt for the Skinwalker by Knapp and Kelleheller. And I happened to be reading in that moment. Where I left off in the book previously, I picked up reading, and it was the account of, I think the pseudonym was Gorman. Was it Gorman, for the owners of the ranch at the time, Skinwalker Ranch?
Yeah.
Whatever the pseudonym was, the individual who owned the ranch had an encounter with a craft that he described in great detail. And it was literally the same thing I saw and was writing about on my screen. And he described it in exactly the same way. And he just every feature was the same. And he said in his description, it was reminiscent of the F-117 Nighthawk.
Crazy.
But it wasn't that, right? It didn't have wings. It was hovering silently. It was, I think he said it was a matte black. What I saw looked matte black or green, like a dark green bordering on black, something like that. Probably, maybe that could have just been the yellow lights in the parking lot, making it look that way. So that was a very interesting synchronicity, right? So I'm reading this, and it's the only account I've ever encountered, by the way, that is analogous to what I saw.
Yeah.
And I've talked to lots of UFO guys who study the different kinds of craft and who catalog these different kinds of craft, and they didn't have an account of a craft like I saw. So I was always sort of baffled, like, well, what the heck did I see then? And here it is being described in perfect detail at Skinwalker Ranch.
And of course, right, and it happens to be at Skinwalker, no less, one of the most famous, UFO hotspots, I guess you could say. This is kind of an abstract question, Tim, but I want to ask it because what you described there, those kinds of things have happened to me as well. And I kind of rack my brain when something like that happens. And it's normally actually within a writing process. If I'm writing down notes, I'm investigating something for an episode here on UAP, and it's happened more than once actually, where I'm in the middle of writing about something and then I come across that very thing from another source and I'm like, that's weird. Is there something to that? Again, I know it's abstract, but is there something there that actually leads us to, you think, to be in that moment and almost get like a confirmation of some type of unconscious confirmation that tells us what you've experienced or what you're investigating is something real and you should keep going with it? Or is it just complete coincidence?
It's certainly serendipitous. I don't know if it's coincidental or not, but
Right.
there are. It does appear that I've had in my life some very interesting synchronicities. Yeah, there's probably something to that.
Yeah, I often wonder that, and maybe it's just for maybe a confirmation bias on my end because it makes me like I make myself crazy sometimes and thinking, is there really something to this? Because it's hard to deny that, like you said, the synchronicities sometimes. Um, when we talk about what you saw that night, there was one question I wanted to ask. Did you feel any heat being that close to it? Did you guys feel
No,
any heat, or the car got hot or anything?
no, not that I recall.
Nothing like that. Okay.
But by the time we jumped out of the car, the craft was already floating over the horizon.
Wild.
So at one point, we were sort of in a daze looking at this craft, and I remember saying, the only thing I remember saying is, that is some top secret stuff. Yeah. I didn't use the word stuff.
Right.
And or classified, I think is the word I used. And then after probably about 30 seconds elapsed, and I said, my brother-in-law's name was Tony. I said, Tony, your phone, because I had a flip phone at the time. He had a smartphone. And so he's jostling for his phone. He pulls it out of his pocket, drops it, reaches down to pick it up. And as he's doing that, the craft lifts up into the air and starts to move away. So that by the time we jump out of the car, it's already descending behind the houses on the horizon. So it was very low. It was very, very low. I don't know if it was scanning for something or what. I don't know, but it was really low.
That is interesting, though, because a lot of times you hear about when the craft leaves in a sighting like that, it's usually some type of instantaneous acceleration event. You shoot up in the sky and it's gone, or it zooms away. This actually descended, though, like over the hills, over some homes, and you lost sight.
Yeah, this was right in the middle of Brook Park, Ohio. It actually went in the direction of the airport.
Oh, wow.
Toward the John Glenn, the NASA center over there.
Makes you wonder.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that it'd be kind of dangerous being in proximity to the airport like that, flying around, but probably wasn't able to be picked up on radar being that low.
Yeah, right. It's not, or some type of stealth technology. Amazing stuff. So outside of that, I did want to ask you too about, I guess, more of, if we can call that the lighter subject, more like the heavy stuff when it comes into a couple of your books, like with Birthright, or where you wrote about the Book of Enoch. And that has become really a big subject on the Book of Enoch front, especially since Representative Anna Paulina Luna has brought that up numerous times, actually, in a couple of posts that she's made on social media. She's referenced it in some interviews. Where do you think, based off of your research, of course, where do you think, or what do you think connects us with the UAP topic and the details that we find in the Book of Enoch?
Well, broadly speaking, the Book of Enoch features an incident in which exceedingly intelligent extraterrestrial beings descend to the earth and have sexual relations with human women who conceive and give birth to a hybrid race of giants. So, again, broadly speaking, the connection would be that the Book of Enoch specifies interaction with non-human intelligence that not only descended to the earth and interacted temporarily with mankind, but cohabitated with mankind and stayed for quite a long time until they were incarcerated. So I suppose that that the Congresswoman is referencing that dynamic. Although I have heard her throw around the term interdimensional quite a bit.
Yeah, right.
And there's nothing explicit in the Enochian tale that would suggest interdimensionality. In fact, quite the opposite. These beings become enamored. They're called watchers, by the way.
Right.
They become enamored of the daughters of men. And indeed, they lust after the daughters of men. And so they decide to descend to the earth in defiance of God. They knew that this action was going to, that this action was going to result in judgment, ultimately, and that they were kindling the ire of the King of Heaven by doing this. But they did it nevertheless. That's why they bound themselves by a mutual oath of, by an oath of mutual imprecations on the summit of Mount Hermon. They descended to the summit of Mount Hermon. And then they descended into the plains, and they chose for themselves, each one chose a maiden that they were going to take to wife. And I think we can infer that they went to those maidens' fathers, because this was a patriarchal society, a true patriarchal society. And there was an exchange, there was a bargain that the Watchers would offer, offered the fathers of these maidens technology, knowledge, in exchange for their hands in marriage. And so there was a transference of knowledge and technology to the human species in the antediluvian world. And it was a Faustian bargain, of course, because the women gave birth to giants, and the giants were exceedingly evil. They were cannibalistic. They were cannibalizing the human race because they were part human, and also each other, according to other Dead Sea Scroll accounts. And but there's nothing really implicit, as I said before here, that would suggest that there's interdimensionality involved. All of this is very tangible. All of this is very physical, material. The Watchers are physically copulating with human women. The women are physically giving birth. They're actually giving birth to giants. So, so I think I can certainly agree that there's, as I keep saying, generally or broadly speaking, there is a connection to the Watchers in that this was an incident in which we were interacting with non-human intelligence, extraterrestrial entities. But I'm not sure how she's deriving the interdimensional aspect. So if Congresswoman Luna is pointing to the book of, if Congresswoman Luna is pointing to the Book of Enoch as proof that these beings are interdimensional, then I'm not tracking with that. I don't understand the correlation there, and maybe I'm just not seeing something that she's seeing. But I don't understand the correlation, if that's what she means.
So it's,
maybe you have some insight into that.
Well, I guess just on that note, I think where she's coming from, and I don't, I hate to speak for her and be wrong, but I think where she's coming from is where the information comes on from David Grush, where David Grush has spoken about the possibility of, non-human intelligence coming from an interdimensional aspect. And so he's mentioned that specifically. So that's my,
as a potential theory.
Right, exactly. So that's my thinking that's kind of where she gathers that term.
I'm not aware, and I think I can say this safely. I interact with some of these individuals, and I'm not aware of any proof, of any definitive proof that any of this is interdimensional. And I've talked to people who've been in those skiffs, and they've told me that there has never been presented anything definitive that would prove the interdimensional hypothesis. Now there are lots of opinions, varying opinions, by the way, but nobody has definitive proof.
Sure. And
so it remains a hypothesis.
Right.
I'm not opposed to it, by the way.
Yeah.
But I feel like people who throw around the word interdimensional don't really understand what it implies.
Well, right. And actually I was just about to ask that. It's funny you say it, in that how do you even explain interdimensional? Because it almost feels like, Tim, it's almost like become like a buzzword. It's become like this buzz term that people kind of just put out there as a possibility. But a lot of times, and I'm not trying to put anybody down by saying this, but a lot of times I think people don't really understand what they're even saying when they say interdimensional. So, I mean, how would you explain that to somebody?
I think I would echo the words of Eric Weinstein, who recently on American Alchemy with Jesse Michaels said that when he hears people invoke the word interdimensional in regard to this phenomenon, he throws up a little in his mouth.
That's right.
And I understand why he's saying that, because he's a mathematician and has a very good grasp on physics, much better than me. I'm not a mathematician. I'm absolutely terrible at math. I'm the opposite of a mathematician. But I do understand that when you say interdimensional, you're not really saying anything. You think about it. There's a couple of different ideas that are being sandwiched together here. Actually, there's a multiplicity of ideas that are being sandwiched together here when people invoke interdimensional. Are you saying that these beings are using interdimensional pathways to travel? Or are you saying that these beings by nature are interdimensional? That their ontology, that they are interdimensional by nature? What are we saying here? So when you say interdimensional beings, because those are two completely different ideas, right?
Sure, right.
If you have beings who are making use of, and it's not really, the terminology isn't even really accurate here, because it's, if you open up let's say a gateway, an Einstein Rosen bridge, for example, wormhole, connecting one part of the universe to another, there's nothing. The only interdimensional aspect there is you're bending space-time. And you may be folding space-time into a dimension that we can't perceive or that we haven't detected, right? A fifth dimension or something like that. So maybe you're folding space-time into an extra dimension so that you can open up this route, this shortcut from one part of the universe to another. So in that sense, if a being is, let's say they're in an advanced aerospace vehicle, they project some kind of technology, they're able to open up a wormhole, say from planet Earth to Mars, to the surface of Mars. Well, maybe there's an interdimensional aspect there in the sense that the wormhole is, again, folded into a dimension of space that we can't directly access or perceive. Yeah. But the beings themselves, it wouldn't mean that the beings are interdimensional by nature, and it wouldn't mean that the destination is interdimensional. They would be going from planet Earth to planet Mars, right? So this is where people get really confused. The only, in my mind, and physicists and mathematicians can correct me, in my mind, the only true interdimensional being would have to come from a different universe, a universe that has different physical properties in the Earth, and that is in the true sense a different dimension altogether, and that being would have to be, the physiology of that being, everything would be different about that being, that entity, right? And then they would be coming from, let's say, like a multiverse type scenario, which I do not believe in the multiverse. I think it's absurd. But let's, for the sake of argument here, to illustrate the point, let's say that a being comes from a multiverse. And a multiverse would be, the multiverse was created, multiverse theory was formulated to circumvent the fine-tuning of the universe, right? The fine-tuning of the universe is apparent that the universe was fine-tuned to be the way it is and to allow for the proliferation of life. Well, there's really only one answer. If you concede, which physicists do, that the universe is fine-tuned, our universe is fine-tuned, that means that there was a tuner. That means that there was an intelligent designer. Somebody designed this system to be exactly the way it is because it is so finely tuned, right? And a lot of these atheistic physicists and scientists, they don't like that conclusion. So in order to circumvent that conclusion, they came up with multiverse. Because multiverse allows you to deny the ultimate conclusion of a fine-tuned universe, which is there must be a maker, there must be a designer, intelligent design. Because what they say is, no, it just so happens that our universe is finely tuned. But there are billions of other universes out there that aren't finely tuned like our universe. We just happen to live in the one that is finely tuned. And it's a concoction, again, that was formulated to circumvent intelligent design. And what do you call it? A MacGuffin. It's a MacGuffin that's used in all kinds of films. It's very, very, it's a very useful narrative if you're making a sci-fi film like Avengers, the MCU universe, to have a multiverse, because then you can do all kinds of things and you don't have to explain anything, right? Because you have this multiverse in place, this multiverse construct in the background. And so people have sort of integrated the multiverse nonsense into their thinking about extraterrestrials, into their thinking about aliens, into their thinking about angels, into their thinking about whatever. They're just saying integrate multiverse without realizing what they're doing. So if you have a being coming from the multiverse, coming from a planet that is completely different physics than the Earth, a universe, not a planet, a universe, a completely separate universe than planet Earth. I keep saying planet, I'm sorry. Then our universe, a separate universe, then this is already confusing. I'm just making it even more confusing. If you're coming from a universe that's not our universe, then you would truly be an interdimensional being. But if you're a being within our universe, making use of interdimensional pathways or tunnels or gateways or portals, whatever, that doesn't mean that you yourself are interdimensional. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
it means that you could be coming from any other place inside of the universe and just be accessing the extra dimensions that are potentially inherent in the universe. This gets very confusing because there's a lot of different ideas out there, a lot of different theories. We're not really on solid ground because nobody's ever detected definitively an extra dimension. It's all theoretical, all of it. It's all theoretical.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's what makes it, so fascinating to discuss and theorize about it, because, and there is one theory, actually, maybe more of an analogy that I'll throw you, and you've probably heard it before, but it relates to what we're talking about, from Jacques Vallée, where he talks about, or I've heard him talk about anyway, the fly in the box, where if you have this fly in a box, you got, all the sides is closed, and then that is the world that the fly knows. That fly thinks, this is my world, here's my walls, I can't get out, this is where I'm living. And then all of a sudden you open the top of the box and we are the fly, and you realize it's all perception. And that's where it's just to kind of fit it into the conversation here. And I think where you're coming from, which is that it could be a perception thing. And that's just a point.
Allegory of the cave.
Yeah.
Right. We could be seeing shadows of other dimensions, which is fine. Like I said, I subscribe to the hyperspace theory of the universe, which posits that there are more imperceivable dimensions to our universe. Okay, that's the key, to our universe, than we can directly interact with, right? So if that's the case, we're still operating within our universe, and beings who make use of those extra dimensions are not by nature interdimensional.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying this term interdimensional being, it doesn't say anything. What does it tell me? What you think? And I'm not saying I'm just curious. I'm just kicking this idea back to you.
Oh, yeah.
When you hear interdimensional being, what distinguishes an interdimensional being from us?
Yeah, I think it just kind of comes back to where it's a buzz term for people, right? They just say it, they hear it, they think it sounds cool, and it almost makes you kind of harken back to watching the Marvel movies or reading comic books, and you think
You
about
have
these,
to.
right, exactly. You come through a portal, right? And that's something that people kind of imagine when they hear interdimensional being. What I think about personally is more along the lines of what the fly in the box analogy that Jacques Vallée has put forth, which is a perception we can only
Yes,
perceive so much, right? Where almost
exactly.
use the metaphor of um, what our eyes can perceive. We can only see so much when it comes to the visual spectrum. And so if we kind of put that toward, is there this extra spectrum, such as a visual spectrum, this extra spectrum of reality that we can't perceive? That's kind of where I land of what interdimensional anyway
I
would
totally
mean
agree
in
with
that
that.
sense. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think it's perceptual. As I said, and I will continue to say, because people say, "Well, you don't believe that there's other dimensions." I do. I believe in the hyperspatial theory of the universe. Um, but this term interdimensional being, as if we're in a realm of ontology here, that interdimensional is a different, like. So here's a good question that I like to pose, and people just get mad usually when I pose this. Not you, people like you, but people who really are dead set on this idea that these aliens are just extraterrestrial demons or something, or rather interdimensional demons. And it's a very simple question. What is the difference fundamentally between an extraterrestrial and an interdimensional?
Hmm.
So what's the difference between an extraterrestrial being and an interdimensional being? What's the difference? See, it's a distinction without a difference, if you think about it. And people will say, well, interdimensional beings, they come from other dimensions. It's like, okay, well, what are you invoking when you say other dimensions? Are you invoking a multiverse? Or are you saying they come from some other dimension within our universe, right? Another facet of our universe that we can't perceive. Because if that's the case, then they're still extraterrestrial beings.
Right.
You've made a distinction without a difference. And
Yeah.
the reason why this is such a pet peeve of mine is because people think they're saying something profound when they're not saying anything at all, or at least they're not saying anything different than if you were to say these are extraterrestrial beings, right? I have
Yeah.
a friend that he told me this wild encounter he had with some UFOs. He said he was driving down a road in California. He driving home from work, routine, and it was the middle of the day, and it was a highway. And as he's driving along, he notices a billboard. He looks over at the billboard, it catches his attention. It says he's looking at this billboard. He sees, I forget if it was above or next, there's above the billboard. This portal opens up in the sky, like a circle just opens up, right? Like in a Marvel movie, just a circle opens up in the
Saw
sky.
this.
He saw
this
it.
happen. Wow.
And he just sort of took his foot off the gas and he's just staring at this. And he said he could see a different atmosphere through that circle in the sky. So it was our atmosphere, but it was like looking through a hole in the sky, and it was a different atmosphere in the hole through the portal, or whatever it was, different atmosphere. And then I forget if it was 2 or 3 flying saucers came shooting out of it. So they came from whatever that atmosphere was into our atmosphere, and then the thing closed, the portal closed. So very, very Marvel-esque, right? Experience that he had there. And when he told me that, I found that to be very intriguing, because the question in my mind is, what was that other atmosphere? Because there's various different possibilities. Could have been some other part of the earth. So if you're over here where I live in Montana, it's very gray and rainy right now. If a portal opened up to, let's say, Arizona, where it's dry and sunny, that would look very different in the sky. I'd be looking at Arizona's dry, sunny atmosphere in contrast to my gray, rainy atmosphere.
Right.
So it'd be very different. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, the portal is not, I'm not looking at a different part of the earth. I'm looking at a different planet, the atmosphere of a different planet. Let's say Mars, the surface of Mars would look very different than our atmosphere. Okay. Well, we can understand both of those things, right?
Sure.
That would make sense to us. But to me, you'd be jumping the shark if you said, well, that's a different dimension that you're looking into. So those flying saucers, they came from a different dimension. Well, what does that even mean?
Right. How would you define that?
A different dimension that has an atmosphere, a sky that kind of looks like ours, but a different color maybe? What does that even mean? And then these 3 saucers, I think it was 3, that came out, they're obviously flying the same from where they came and where they are. So the laws of physics are probably the same. I think it would be a reasonable deduction that the laws, or inference, that the laws of physics are the same on both sides of that portal.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't see why they would be different. So if that was a different dimension, you would expect to see something different than an atmosphere. I mean, we don't even know what we have no idea what a different dimension looks like. So to me, I think it's very likely, and of course, I don't have any proof for this. This is just speculation. I think it's very likely that these craft are utilizing technology that allows them, they can generate enough energy to open up, Einstein-Rosen bridge, and that they can jump space, so to speak. They can instantly transfer themselves from one part of the universe or one part of the earth to another. There is nothing whatsoever interdimensional about that. Aside from the fact that we mentioned earlier, that maybe they're folding space into an imperceivable dimension, right? In order to create that tunnel, the tunnel through space-time. But there's nothing interdimensional about the craft or the beings. They're just coming from somewhere else in the universe. So I think there's a lot of confusion. And I'll say this, for whatever reason, I'm trying to figure this out. I really am. I'm an old school guy when it comes to ufology. I don't like all these newfangled ideas because they're popping up every day. There's a new idea about where UFOs come from and the beings. And some of these are old ideas that are being rehashed, but all of these new hypotheses are emerging. And everybody is suddenly, and when I say suddenly, maybe in the last 5 years, everybody is suddenly acting as if the extraterrestrial hypothesis is debunked. That's hypothesis is obviously, and it's an archaic idea. We don't think that anymore. We've evolved beyond that. These are obviously interdimensional or time travelers or crypto-terrestrial or what have you, right? I'm like, okay, maybe, but isn't the easiest explanation extraterrestrial? I mean, if you can open a portal and jump from one part of the earth to the other, then I would imagine you could jump from the surface of Mars to the earth in the same way.
Sure.
And if you can jump from the surface of Mars to the earth, then the extraterrestrial hypothesis is looking pretty good. Because it would not be difficult for beings coming from some other planet to get to the earth with that kind of technology. It'd be quite simple, assuming that level of technology. It'd be as simple as us getting on the highway and driving to the next town over. Actually, it'd be much more simple than that.
True.
So why? What is the reason why everybody wants to trash the extraterrestrial hypothesis? Why? Is it just trendy? Does it just make them feel intelligent to appeal to time travel or to appeal to extra dimension or the interdimensional hypothesis, or to appeal to the disembodied consciousness that's just manifesting itself and trying to experience the world or whatever? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, some of these hypotheses are interesting, but it's the one that's staring us right in the face is the one that everybody just wants to disregard. I cannot comprehend why. I don't understand. Do you? I mean, I don't even know what what you think about any of this, but what are your thoughts on that? Curious.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of very strong points in that sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one when it comes to, listen, let's look back at some of the old stories. When it comes to two that come to my mind right away, Admiral Byrd, Operation High Jump. He talks about going down to Antarctica post World War II, and you have this craft. I think he mentions it as a flying saucer in his
Saucer.
journal, where it's like instantaneously goes from one pole to the next.
Yeah.
So, I mean, where does that come from? And then again, this is going back to, I think soon after World War II. I think it was 1947, around the time of Roswell, I believe. And then you look at something like Betty and Barney Hill, where you have these abductees, and Betty Hill talks about how they gave her this star map, and she draws this star map, and we come to find out like 50 years later that it points to, another star system. I believe it was Alpha Centauri. So, I think to your point, Tim, where we kind of forget some of these stories that might be real clear indications as to where these things are coming from.
Yeah, I think people are locked into particular paradigms. And
which is a shame, because I don't think, and that's to answer your question too, I don't think there is one answer, to be fair. I think it could be a mix of things. I think it could be a mix of, maybe there's some type of or whether we call it wormhole travel from one place to the next, or it's interplanetary, or whatever we define as interdimensional, whatever that means. Maybe it's something that we can't even explain.
Well, I think we can say at the very least it's interplanetary. I mean,
I think we have to start there. Yeah.
If these entities can jump space, then there's no reason to doubt that they have bases on Mars. None. Right. There's no reason to doubt. I mean, and it's very, very plausible that they came from somewhere like Mars, and that they've had forward operating bases on the Earth and under the Earth and under the sea. We know that they can maneuver in outer space the same way that they maneuver in our atmosphere. They're not affected by, they're transmedium, right?
Right.
Because exactly. They bend the fabric of space-time. They don't move through space-time. They move space-time around the craft.
Exactly. Right.
So that's why they're quote unquote transmedium. So a craft that has these capabilities can go anywhere and can come from anywhere. I can draw a straight line from what I've observed myself, from what other people have reported about these craft. I can draw a straight line from the idea that they're here on Earth and the idea that they came from somewhere that's not Earth. I can draw a straight line. It's very easy, or at least, it's just the theory. It's just the hypothesis. That's a very easy straight line to draw. Let's make it really easy. They came from Mars. I don't know that they came from Mars, but let's make it really easy. They came from Mars. Everything that we see would be consistent with that kind of an idea. And people say, no. They didn't come from any other planet. They're from here. Well, but couldn't they travel to Mars really easily? I mean, you have to concede that, right? Okay. Well, then they could just as easily have come from another planet. So sure. What I'm trying to say is we are complicating things unnecessarily and then throwing in the time travel stuff. That's not a straight line. That's like a squiggly line that you have to draw and make all these extraneous connections to draw that conclusion.
Actually, someone in the neck of your woods, actually, Montana State, I believe, Dr. Michael Masters.
A friend of mine.
Yeah, there you go. So he's really kind of made that his, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of his main hypothesis of the time traveler theory. So, I mean, how do you guys, knowing that you guys are friends, how do you guys kind of go back and forth on that?
We briefly discussed some of this, but actually we've been meaning to get together here. But he lives up in Butte. I live in Bozeman. And I find him to be brilliant. I think his theories are very, very intriguing. He favors the time traveler theory. I do not. I don't. That's the one theory that I really don't like, because there's a lot of problems with it in my mind. But it's not impossible. I wouldn't say I wouldn't call it absurd or preposterous either. I just don't. I think it's, like I said, it's not the most direct explanation. It doesn't account for all the data in my mind. It seems clear to me, there's a couple of things that I would have to say when analyzing this phenomenon, that I would have to concede, rather, as an honest researcher. The first thing that I would have to concede is that there seems to be a very ancient presence. Now, that's as a Christian, I come from a biblical worldview. As a Christian, that coheres to what I understand theologically, biblically, that mankind has been interacting with non-human intelligence from the very beginning. That's a biblical fact. Now, Christians like to describe that non-human intelligence as angels or fallen angels or demons, but those are just terms. That's just terminology. And some of that terminology is just occupational descriptor, like angel. Angel's an occupational descriptor. It doesn't give us any insight into the nature, the ontology of a being. It just describes what they do. Human beings, by the way, are also described as angels in the Old Testament when they're functioning in the capacity of an envoy, of a messenger. That's what the word angel means. So we would have to concede, as a Christian and as a ufologist, I would concede that some of this phenomena is ancient, exceedingly ancient. Okay, I can check both of those boxes as a ufologist and as a Christian.
Yeah.
That statement coheres, okay? Then I would have to acknowledge as a ufologist that some of this phenomena seems to be more recent. And specifically the activity of gray aliens in the abduction program. That seems to be more recent. That seems to be more modern.
Yes.
Now, I understand, I'm fully aware that Jacques Vallée, who's a phenomenal researcher, sort of the grandfather of ufology in some ways, one of the grandfathers of ufology, him and Hynek and Stringfield and some of these other guys, that Vallée wrote about this phenomenon, the possibility, let's put it in these terms, the potential that this phenomenon is just adapting to the zeitgeist of each generation, of each era. In other words, in the medieval period, they viewed the abduction phenomena and the UFO phenomenon as sky people or gnomes or fairies, and that the phenomenon has been evolving, adapting rather, wearing different masks, as it were, presenting itself in ways that are relevant to each consecutive generation. It's an interesting idea, but there's a fatal flaw, and that flaw is that the stories of gnomes and fairies and abduction by gnomes and fairies and sky people do not conform to the modern abduction phenomenon. They just don't conform. There is nothing like the modern abduction phenomenon in the past.
Yeah,
there's nothing like it.
Yeah,
it is entirely distinct. And anybody who takes the time to study the phenomenon knows that it's the abduction phenomenon, knows that it is entirely distinct. It's not the medieval stories of fairies and gnomes and sky people.
That's right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and I don't even think it's maybe the closest one. If we look back at ancient and biblical times, maybe the closest one to a modern abduction account would be Ezekiel. But that's, other than that, I'm with you.
Those are visionary experiences. The prophets in the Old Testament, when they would have, and in the New, when they would have these experiences, most of these experiences, not all of them, most of them are happening within a realm of perception, a perceptive realm. They're symbolic. And that certainly is what was happening with Ezekiel. When Ezekiel's wheel that was temple terminology. And that's a different discussion. I don't believe that was a craft. That was temple symbology. But there are some other interesting, what I think were literal encounters, like the chariots of the chariots of Israel, the chariots of fire, which
Yeah.
is the same thing, the chariots of Yahweh, which is the same thing, which seem to be advanced aerospace vehicles, but we can table that conversation. But getting back to alien abduction, this phenomenon seems to be much more recent. Now, it's possible that the Greys have been here for a while. Maybe they came, maybe there was a forward operating group that came and established bases under the sea, maybe mobile bases. I really like that idea. The idea of a mobile base that, that builds the craft to spec. There was that, was it a Reddit? I think it was a Reddit, an anonymous poster some years ago. Very, very compelling, talking about this mobile underground facility facility that was moving around on the floor of the ocean that was building craft to spec. Okay, that's very interesting. But it's possible that the Greys had a forward base operation, established themselves here some time ago. But the abduction phenomenon is not ancient, not as we know it today.
Yeah.
And it can be tracked back to the mid to late 1800s. So there are aspects of this phenomenon that are not ancient. And again, this is approaching the topic as a ufologist. I would have to concede that, knowing what I know about alien abduction. So it's highly complex. So were there ancient non-human entities, non-human intelligences interacting with the human species going back to the beginning? As a ufologist and as a Christian, my answer is yes. Yes, I can say that from both of those perspectives. Are there aspects of this phenomenon that seem to be new, relatively speaking, going back 150 years or so? I can also answer that question in the affirmative as a researcher. And those are things that I feel like I can be very confident about. Now, when you throw in time travel, interdimensionality, all these other theories, there's nothing concrete. There's nothing that you can actually point to prove that any of these beings are time traveling that I'm aware of. It's all highly speculative.
There's a lot of, right, it causes a lot of different roads and things, that a lot of different questions, like you said. Gosh, do you still have time, Tim? Because there's still so much I would love to cover with you. So I want to jump back real quick and talk about time travel. Jump back in time real quick to something that we mentioned earlier in, well, what we would call, I think, and this is kind of what I wanted to mention, the Nephilim, the giants, this interbreeding that took place with, call it angelic creatures, non-human intelligences that took place during ancient biblical times. Is there a distinction between what we call the Nephilim mentioned in the Old Testament, which I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think the final mention of that, and a giant in the Old Testament was Og of Bashan, I believe. So is there a difference, say, between Og and these other beings that were created through interbreeding in the Book of Enoch?
Well, not just in the Book of Enoch, in Genesis 6 as well.
Right.
The difference is that the post-flood giants were thought to have come from the pre-flood giants. In other words, that they were their descendants. And they were certainly gigantic in stature. The Bible tells us that the Anakim were descended from the Nephilim. And the Anakim are one of the clans of giants that inhabited the land of Canaan, the promised land, during the time of the patriarchs, and also, obviously, the conquest of Canaan by Joshua. That's when they encountered Og of Bashan, who was of the Rephaim. And there were various clans of giants. There were the Anakim, there were the Rephaim, there were the Emim, there were the Amorites. Some of the Amorites were described as being giants and so forth. So the giant clans occupying the land of Canaan, again, in the minds of the Hebrews, were descended from the Nephilim. But they were likely much smaller in stature. And the Nephilim were direct descendants, or rather, they were the progeny of the Watchers themselves. So the Nephilim were the sons of the Watchers. They were the original genetic stock, so to speak. And the post-flood giants are diminished descendants, diminished in the sense that they're not directly related to the Watchers. They are descendants who are far removed from the Nephilim. Nevertheless, they retain the gigantic stature relative to the populations, the normal-sized, normal human beings inhabiting Canaan. There's reason to believe that the giants were, when we talk about post-flood giants, the clans of giants in the Levant, that their stature was typically between 10 and 15 feet or 16 feet tall. And the reason why I say that, I'm not shooting in the dark there. In the Masoretic text, Goliath is described as 6 cubits in the span, his stature. And that equates to about 10 feet tall. And when you read some extra biblical material, especially from the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's be specific, in the Book of Jubilees, the author of Jubilees says that the giants, that their stature was between 10 and 16 feet tall. And that seems consistent, obviously, with the story of Goliath, of Gath, and also with the accounts of giants all over the world, post-flood giants, even here in America, giants that were discovered in the mounds of America, the Indian mounds.
Yeah.
And also the giants, legends of giants all over the world, especially on the island of Sardinia, where I've done a lot of research. I've been there a few times. And people who've dug up the bones of giants with their hands and have told me about it. People I've interviewed, elderly people mostly, who describe these beings as being anywhere from, let's say, approximately 9 to 15 feet tall.
It's incredible.
So, so that was a long way to answer your question. Yes, the giants after the flood were diminished in stature than the ones before the flood. And the Nephilim, that refers to the original strain, the original genetic breed of giants who were the direct sons of the Watchers. All these other giants were descended from the Nephilim.
Okay, that makes sense. Why do you think, Tim, that, and maybe this might be an impossible question to answer because then we get into, maybe some type of biblical philosophy and theology. So it's not sure we can have a definitive answer, but why do you think the fathers of the church, the ones who were there saying this goes in the Bible and this doesn't, why do you think the Book of Enoch is one of those that is not in the traditional Bible that we have today?
The simplest answer is because the Jews excluded Enoch from their canon.
What made them, what brought them to that, do you think? I mean, well,
I would agree with Tertullian, the church father from North Africa. I would agree with Tertullian, who said that, basically paraphrasing, he believed that the Jews had rejected the Book of Enoch because it testified of the man they had crucified, namely Jesus of Nazareth. Specifically, the oracles of Enoch, in the section called the Parables, which is after in First Enoch. The first section of First Enoch is called the Book of the Watchers. The second section is called the Parables, and then in the Parables you have a lot of messianic content concerning the Son of Man, which clearly pointed to Jesus of Nazareth. The early church fathers knew that. And the ones who regarded the book, and there were plenty of them, who regarded the Book of Enoch as scripture. And it should be said that they had a manuscript of First Enoch that we don't have today, because they quote from First Enoch, and we don't have that text in what we call today First Enoch. A lot of it is there, but not all of it. So we don't really know. what the manuscript that was circulating during the early church age, what that looked like. It definitely had the Book of the Watchers in it, and it definitely had the parables. But there may have been other sections added into what we call First Enoch today that were preserved in Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls maybe were additions that were added during the Second Temple period. But there was a lot of debate about the Book of Enoch among the church fathers, again, some of whom quoted First Enoch as scripture. The early church was very conversant with First Enoch, with at least portions of First Enoch. Again, the Book of the Watchers and the oracles of Enoch and the parables. So there's no dispute there. Ultimately, it was rejected, to reiterate, because the Jews rejected it in their canon, but also because the authorship and dating of Enoch really can't be established. It's very difficult to establish who the author was. I personally believe that the oldest portions of First Enoch either were authored by Enoch himself and were preserved through the flood, and then the manuscript was copied and transcribed, or at the very least, the oral traditions come from the antediluvian world, and were ultimately written down. Now, it's interesting. I referenced the Book of Jubilees. In Jubilees, the author of Jubilees, which was probably written during the Maccabean period, by the way, but it reflects how the Jews were thinking about the antediluvian world. The author of Jubilees states that there were documents, there were manuscripts that came through the flood and that were written in Hebrew, because he believes that the language of the antediluvian world was Hebrew, but that obviously nobody spoke Hebrew. Abraham didn't speak Hebrew. Abraham came from Mesopotamia. So he spoke Akkadian or whatever it was that they spoke in Mesopotamia at the time. And that God had miraculously enabled him to speak and understand Hebrew. And that when that happened, he was able to understand and transcribe the documents which he inherited from his fathers, from his descendants, or rather from his antecedents, going back to Noah. So there were at least there was at least a Hebrew tradition, a Jewish tradition during the Maccabean period, that Abraham had inherited these documents from Noah that nobody could understand because they were written in a language that was no longer extant, in a language that had disappeared from the earth, and that because of this miracle, this miraculous incident in which Abraham could understand Hebrew, speak and understand Hebrew, he was able then to transmit that knowledge to his offspring. Now, whether or not that's true, I doubt that's true. I think I would consider that to be a Jewish fable. But it illustrates the idea that the Jews believe that their traditions came not just from Abraham, but from Noah and from the antediluvian world. And I think that's true. At the very least, oral traditions. And then those oral traditions were transcribed, were written down. But I personally believe that there are manuscripts. There were manuscripts that were entrusted to Noah before the flood and preserved by him. Tertullian thought that as well. And one of those manuscripts was whatever Enoch wrote. Enoch, by the way, was not just considered to be a prophet by the Jews. We know that he was considered to be a prophet because in the book of Jude, in the Bible, Jude incorporates a portion of the book of Enoch directly.
Yeah.
It's copied and pasted.
That's right.
From the Book of the Watchers in First Enoch. And Jude says Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, so Enoch was a prophet. That's not contested. The Jews believed Enoch was a prophet. But they also believed he was a scribe. And in fact, the foremost on both accounts. He was the most preeminent prophet and the most preeminent scribe. Now, what is a scribe? A scribe is somebody who writes things down. So obviously there's a tradition here among the Jews that portions of the Book of Enoch were written by Enoch's own hand.
Well,
so the main influence for the rejection of Enoch in the canon came from Augustine and St. Augustine. And there was a lot of, this gets into some deep theological and philosophical territory, which we don't have to tread right now. But
sure.
To summarize, there were competing ideas emerging in the church, what was the Catholic Church at the time, in regard to angels and in regard to Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism, and ideas about heaven and spiritual beings and heavenly realms, and the way they thought about angels was sort of evolving. And Enoch presents a very visceral, tangible, physical encounter with angels. Angels are lusting. Angels are copulating. They're having sex with women.
Yeah.
They're procreating. They're depositing seed and procreating offspring and cohabiting the earth with human beings. I mean, that's a very literal, physical, tangible view of angels. And those kinds of ideas were evolving in the church. And so that contributed certainly to Enoch being rejected. But again, there were problems with the dating and the authorship, and no one could prove that Enoch had written First Enoch. And I'm not sure that there was a Hebrew copy of First Enoch. There may have been an Aramaic copy or maybe just Greek translations. And that would have contributed to it being rejected as well. I mean, the Jews really only incorporated manuscripts that they had in Hebrew. And so there's a lot of factors. What I'm trying to do is express to you there's a multiplicity of factors. It's a complex situation. And it's important for the listeners to understand that what we have today as First Enoch is not necessarily the same manuscript that was circulating at the time when the church fathers were deliberating over this text. Some of it is certainly the same. As I said, the Book of the Watchers and the parables are I think we can assume are the same based on the quotations from those sections.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of draw a comparison to the two. And I really do want to get to Peru as well with you before we're done here today. But if you're running out of time at any point, just say, hey, maybe next time. But I think it's important to draw a comparison with the Book of Enoch and what we're experiencing today with UAP disclosure and the movement to try to get these secrets out, to stop the cover up, because you kind of see at least some parallels where some people try to bury some information in that and say, well, that's not true because we can't prove X, Y, and Z. But I do find it interesting how you can draw direct parallels to, like you said, at least with the Book of Jude and some other things when it comes to the current Old Testament, and how people do want to try to keep some of the stuff under wraps or try to demonize it over the years or over the centuries. And that kind of leads me to a question too, Tim. You say you talk to researchers, and I'll let this lead into your Peruvian explorations as well. You talk to researchers who have actually dug up bones, they've told you, of giants. So we're talking about, according to these accounts, physical evidence, about as physical as you can get, evidence of giants existing at some point, not only from the biblical terms, but from physical science of having these bones. So why do you think mainstream science wants to literally keep those things buried? Why do you think they don't want people to accept that this was part of our past?
Well, again, I'm going to have to invoke the complexity of the situation here because there could be various reasons.
Yeah.
But for me, nothing really makes sense except for the proposition that the occult is involved. And the reason why I say that is because I used to think that, well, the reason why they are lying about the bones of giants and that they are so committed to omitting the existence of giants from the historical record is because of the Darwinian paradigm, the Darwinian worldview, evolution by natural selection. It doesn't really fit that paradigm very well. And in addition to that, it would validate the testimony of the Old Testament. And undoubtedly there's truth to those statements, but more so to the second than to the first. The existence of giants, as far as I understand it, doesn't really compromise the theory of evolution. It would be very easy for a Darwinist to just draw another branch in the evolutionary chain, right?
Sure.
Oh, well, these giants must have descended from this. We already have that.
Yeah.
Gigantopithecus was a giant upright bipedal ape.
Right.
So we already have a potential. It would be very easy for evolutionists to attach the existence of giants, humanoid giants, to Gigantopithecus. Oh, they just evolved on this branch of the tree. Done. Easy, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
I don't see any problem with that.
Right.
I don't subscribe to the theory of evolution, but certainly in my mind, it wouldn't be difficult.
Easy for them to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't be difficult to resolve that problem. Now, in regard to the existence of giants verifying elements of the Old Testament, well, that's undoubtedly true, but it's broader than that. The Old Testament is not exclusive in its recording of the existence of giants, right? And its testimony in regard to giants. Every ancient culture around the world has a tradition of giants, and many of them wrote about giants. The best example here is the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Mesopotamians clearly believed that giants existed, and there's a lot of other examples as well. Basically, everybody in the Near East, in the ancient Near East,
It's true.
understood that giants existed and had traditions, and some of them written records of giants, in various capacities. Whether we're talking about in mythological stories or giants who fought in battles or who people encountered in narratives, right? So it's not exclusive to the Hebrew account. This would be an attestation of the existence of giants as recorded by the ancient Near Eastern people in general, not specifically the Bible. The Bible's included in there for sure, and perhaps most prominently because I'm not sure that any other ancient text speaks so directly about giants.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't know. But the Bible certainly does. So, I mean, that argument seems weak, that they're hiding it because they don't want to validate the Bible. Okay, maybe there's some truth to that. But neither of those arguments are strong enough to account for the secrecy surrounding this, the aggressive secrecy surrounding this topic. I like to say, because this is what I've encountered, that it seems to me that the topic of giants is more highly classified than the topic of UFOs and aliens. This is what I've encountered out there in the world. That individuals who have knowledge of let's say who maybe were individuals who might be described as adjacent to the crash retrieval program, or if not directly involved, they'll talk to you about UFOs. They'll talk to you about aliens. They'll talk to you about Greys, Nordics. I mean, they won't go on a podcast with you and talk about it publicly, but they'll talk to you about it privately. Yeah, they'll say things, over a whiskey and cigar that they wouldn't say on a Zoom call. But I don't think I've ever encountered anybody willing to talk openly about giants.
So strange.
In any setting.
It seems like an easy leap to make too. I mean, and that's what kind of confounds me about the secrecy surrounding the existence of giants. It feels like an easy explanation, at least easier to me than to explain what we were talking about earlier, all the theoretical science behind extraterrestrials.
It does. And I should clarify, it's not that they don't want to talk about the individuals that I've spoken with, that they don't want to talk about it because they don't know about it. Rather, when I broach the topic, it's like, oh, no. We can't go there. Or it's like, literally looking at me and going like this.
Wow. That's
that sort of
the signal. No more.
So it's it's for whatever reason, it's highly classified. And I suspect, as I said in the beginning, that the reason why it's so highly classified is it's entangled with the occult. That's my guess. And people will recall that there were in the WikiLeaks emails, John Podesta's emails were leaked, among many other things. And in one of those emails, apparently Hillary Clinton was inquiring about the resurrection tomb of Gilgamesh,
right?
About the location of his body.
Yeah.
Well, that's consistent with with the cult of giants in the ancient Near East, specifically the Canaanite cult of giants. This is where the term Rephaim comes from, by the way. The root word for Rephaim, which was the clan of giants in the land of Canaan, in the Levant, comes from the root word Rapha. And the word Rapha means to heal or to mend, but it also means to reconstitute. You could also derive from it the word to reconstitute or to resurrect. And the idea was that the giants had a capability, perhaps, to what do you call it in the I'm trying to think of this. There's a term in the superhero movies for the superpower to be able to heal yourself. I can't remember what that term is.
Like regeneration?
Regeneration. Thank you. Regeneration. That the giants had the ability to regenerate themselves, and that's why you had to cut their heads off. But also, certainly, they believe that the giants, after they died, that you could still maintain communication with them, and you could invoke their disembodied spirits. You could bring them back into the land of the living. Or, according to the Book of Enoch, when the giants died, God cursed them. And the curse was that their spirits would persist in the world as vagabond wraiths, disembodied vagabond wraiths. And that they would experience all the desires of the flesh. In other words, they'd be hungry and thirsty and so forth. But they wouldn't have bodies through which to satiate those desires.
Wow.
And to quench those appetites. And so they seek to inhabit bodies. And of course, this is what we find in the New Testament. So the tradition, the Canaanite tradition, was the cult, the cult of giants revolved around, they would hold a feast, and it was thought that the dead could join them in the feast, and they would invoke different giants. They would invoke the Rephaim, and they would invite them to commune and probably to inhabit certain individuals. And I could talk for a very long time about this, because there's rites on the island of Sardinia, the rite of incubation, which it was a rite of passage for young people who would incubate in the tombs of the giants. That's what they're called to this day, the tombs of the giants, in order to commune with the spirits of dead giants, the mighty ones who were likely buried beneath the tombs. And maybe this was sort of like a machinery, so to speak, for demon possession, for young people to go in there and get demonized and come out, berserker warriors or something, with these supernatural enhancement of demon possession. So there's something that connects the cult of giants, the Canaanite cult of giants, with modern practitioners of the occult. There's a direct link here.
Interesting.
And it's becoming popular now. People are realizing that there's a cult of Baal.
Right.
That the elites are involved in this worship of Baal. And that's true. That's a Canaanite god. And Baal was associated with the giants, and was broadly speaking, was one of the primary deities in the land among the Canaanites. And there's a direct association, without going too deep into the weeds here, there's a direct association with the Rephaim, with the clans of giants and Baal. So those things go hand in hand. And so if you have the elites, let's say, for the sake of argument, somebody like, I don't know, Hillary Clinton,
just to throw a name,
who is involved in the cult of Baal, well, then they would be very, very interested in recovering the bones of giants, as she apparently was.
Yeah.
And not only the bones of giants, but the resurrection tomb, or the resurrection tombs of the giants, maybe to commune with them, maybe to invoke their power, their prowess, maybe to extract knowledge from them, maybe to demonize themselves or other people. Because remember, the spirits of the giants, when they die, they become demons. That's the origin of demons, by the way, in biblical cosmology. Demons are the disembodied spirits of dead giants. So you can see how this would be very useful, advantageous, if you could summon and control the spirits of dead giants, glean information. These are very ancient beings.
Yeah.
Especially the Nephilim from the antediluvian world. Their fathers were the Watchers. They know a lot of stuff, right? So it would be very useful to be able to commune with these beings. And this is the objective of the magician. And when I say magician, I'm not talking about the guy that, makes doves fly out of his sleeve. I'm talking about Aleister Crowley, the real magician. That they call themselves magicians, and magic with a K. That the objective of the magician is to control demonic spirits.
Yeah.
Is to control spirits, is to gain mastery over these things and to use them, to make use of them. And so the cult of Baal is intricately intertwined with the Nephilim and giants and dead giants and tombs of giants and resurrecting or communicating with dead giants, controlling their spirits. It's all there. So that's the long answer, right? To why is all of this hidden? Well, because I think that it's hidden by and when we say the occult, of course, it's a very ambiguous term. The occult doesn't mean your local witch's coven in this sense. It does in one sense, but in this sense, we're talking about the Jeffrey Epstein level elite Luciferian occultists, many of whom are members of the mystery schools. And those are the individuals who would be keeping the lid on this thing.
It's wild. Man, I got to tell you, I didn't see the answer going there. I mean, it's a topic I've always been interested in. I've never been able to really kind of dive into it before, which is why I wanted to ask you about it. I never knew, quite frankly, and I don't often kind of get my mind blown a little bit here on the show, but I'm kind of blew my mind a little bit to kind of draw the connection to all of that and how that's, would cause all this secrecy. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's the only thing that makes sense in my mind. It's just a theory, but it's the only thing that makes sense in my mind. Again, I illustrated how I think that those other two ideas are fairly weak. They don't really have explanatory power in regard to why there's such a tight lid on the topic of giants. Evolution, I think we can scrap that one because we have Gigantopithecus, as I said, and the validation of the biblical narrative. Yeah, there's something there, but it doesn't account for the extreme secrecy.
Yeah, right.
And then you throw in the WikiLeaks email, Hillary Clinton. We're looking at a Canaanitish cult. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the cult of Baal. We're looking at who, by the way, was the adversary of Yahweh.
Right.
In the Old Testament.
I mean, it's basically, another name for, the devil.
That's right. Yes. That's exactly right.
Wow. So on that note, Tim, it's just incredible stuff here today. And there is one thing that I absolutely want to get to before we're done, and that is your exploits in Peru. When I kind of first came across your career and your research and everything was when the face peeler events, the face peeler reports were going on in 2023 in Peru, in South America. I did some investigations into those things, just basically, basic investigation on what I could find online. I put those investigations into the episodes that I did here when I covered that a few years ago. But I was watching from afar some of the things that you were posting at that point, and I found it so intriguing because there again, when we talk about physical evidence with the giants, there was physical evidence going on in Peru, not only in 2023, but also in other reports from decades earlier, I believe in the 70s, that point to 70s or 80s, that pointed to some type of entity attacking people. So when you, and they called them face peelers because for anybody who doesn't know, they would literally, according to lore and what people would find in the bodies, their face would be peeled off. So what do you recall about those investigations? And what, looking back on it now, how do you explain what you went to go witness in Peru a few years back?
Okay, well, yeah, the face peeler phenomenon, the pelacaras, they call them in Spanish, goes back to about the mid-'80s. And the indigenous people inhabiting the jungle. The face peeler phenomenon is kind of like the boogeyman here in the United States, that the mother would tell her child, don't go walking around at night in the jungle, or the face peelers might get you. And the reason why they would say that is because there were incidents of individuals who had gone missing and showed up later, their bodies turned up later with their faces surgically removed.
Crazy.
With great precision.
Right. And I should mention too, and I'm sure you probably get to it as well, but I should mention as a preface that you lived in Peru, for anybody who doesn't know, that you lived in Peru as a teenager for, I don't know how many years, but I know you.
As a young man, yeah. For 10 years, approximately 10 years. So, in fact, I lived in the general area where this was taking place. The recent flap, the recent face peeler flap was taking place in the region of Alto Nanay. And I had spent a great deal of time actually in the jungles in and around Alto Nanay. That's really where I learned to speak Spanish. So I speak a very hillbilly form of Spanish called charapa, which incorporates a lot of Quechua into Spanish and other dialects as well. That's why when I go to Peru today, not so much anymore, but especially when I was younger, because my accent, my charapa accent has probably diminished somewhat. But when I would go to Peru, or when I would go to Lima, the capital of Peru, where they don't speak charapa, they would always find it very amusing. It'd be like, like a Peruvian coming to America and having a really, really deep Southern accent when he spoke English. Right. So anyway, getting back to the face peeler thing, the indigenous people, they believe when they would find these individuals with their faces removed, sometimes with their organs removed as well, they believe basically there are two ideas, and I've heard them both. The first idea is that gringos, again, this goes back to the 80s, gringos were from the CIA or whatever, were in the jungle harvesting organs. Jeez. That's the first idea, that these were gringos with technology and they were harvesting organs. And the second idea was that these were extraterrestrials. These were aliens. And the reason why so many indigenous people to this day think they're extraterrestrials is because of the technology that's deployed, which many of them have seen in the past, and also many of them encountered in the recent flap in 2023. So that happened in the summer, and primarily in the summer of 2023, the months of June and July. And there was there were extended incidents that were unfolding in a number of different villages in the region of Alto Nanay, generally speaking, but also in other parts of the Peruvian Amazon as well. People were experiencing not only face peeler incidents, incursions into their village, but also there were reports of people who were being attacked by UFOs, very much like the Colares incident that happened in Brazil, where there was one young man who reported that a flying saucer was pursuing him and deployed a light and was attempting to lift him off the ground. There was another incident in which there was a group of young people from a college, from a university, who were doing something in the jungle, and they all witnessed this being, this bipedal being that was walking through the forest, the jungle. So incidents like that were breaking out at the same time, apparently related to the face peeler stuff. But specifically, there was a couple of videos that emerged from the village of San Antonio de Pintuyacu in Alto Nanay. And a young man in the village had recorded these videos, and the villagers in the videos, they were filmed at night. The villagers were in a state of disarray. It's a very chaotic scene. They were clearly frightened, running around, shouting and discharging their shotguns at something. And then subsequent interviews revealed that they were pursuing these people, these individuals. Some of them described them as aliens, who looked like the Green Goblin from the Spider-Man movies. You know, that was flying on, the Green Goblin would fly on that platform, and he was dressed in a body armor. And I would discover that that's actually I would discover later that that's actually a very accurate depiction.
Wow. That
these assailants were flying on a platform and dressed in body armor. So this is a very, very long tale. So I'm going to try and truncate it here.
Sure.
As these videos were circulating, going viral on the internet, people were asking me to go down there and investigate, precisely because I'm so familiar with this area of Peru and I speak Spanish, and even more specifically, Charapa. And so I didn't really want to go. I didn't have my passport at the time. I had sent my passport away to get renewed. And so I had a convenient excuse. I don't have my passport. So I just sort of watched this all unfold with everybody else on social media. I did some videos about it on my YouTube channel. I was very intrigued. Me and my friend and colleague, Doug Thornton. And we did a series of videos on this. And ultimately, I got my passport back. And I no longer had an excuse. And so, long story short, I decided to go. I decided to mount an expedition, me and Doug Thornton. And we chartered a riverboat. And I made contact with the village through Ronnie Vernet, the ufologist Ronnie Vernet, a Brazilian ufologist.
Yes.
He helped me make contact with the village. In fact, he put me in contact with Christian. Christian is the one who filmed the footage that went viral, and Christian happened to be the school teacher there in San Antonio de Pintuyacu. And so I recorded what's it called? A WhatsApp. I made a WhatsApp recording at his request, detailing my intentions, what I would like to do, namely that I would like to come and conduct an investigation. Nobody had gone yet. I was kind of surprised. No, I thought somebody was going to go, either a Peruvian journalist, because it was a big deal in Peru. It was all over the news.
Yeah.
I thought a Peruvian journalist was going to travel up there for sure, or some American or some European was going to go and do an investigation. Nobody went. The only person who went was, there was a couple of police officers who were dispatched to go out there. They had a Navy escort, and they went out there because they had to go do an investigation of an attempted abduction. The attempted abduction of a 15-year-old girl named Talia. So they had to go out there and, file a report. They did a piss poor investigation. We could talk about that later. But anyway, they're the ones who concocted the whole jetpack miner narrative,
right?
Which turned out to be utterly false and stupid. And I knew that. That's part of the reason why I went, by the way. This jetpack miner narrative was proliferating, and people were saying, even on like News Nation, mystery solved. It's those pesky river miners with state-of-the-art jetpacks.
I remember that. Yeah, that was like the big,
absurd, absolutely, utterly absurd. And I knew it was absurd. So that's one of the things that prompted me, like, okay, fine, I'm going to go down there and do this because this is stupid. And So when I made contact with the village, the elders, they listened to my recording, and then in response, I got an official invitation. So I didn't just insert. I always say that because I don't want people to think I just inserted myself into the situation. I didn't. I was invited to go.
Okay.
And I decided to also to supply the village, because it was made known to me that they were running out of supplies. They were out of anti-venom, for example, for snake bites. They were running out of ammunition. They were out of food supplies. The men were not going to their chakras, to their little farms out in the jungle, because everybody was in a state of panic and
wow,
and was basically staying close to home. And the men were actually conducting patrols every night. They'd be up all night patrolling the village with their shotguns. So they were kind of in dire straits, and so we decided to supply them with food and medical supplies. And Doug and I decided to bring some strategic technology, including to aid them in their patrols, including high-powered flashlights, which are exceedingly useful in the jungle. High-powered flashlights, really good radios so that they could communicate with each other on their patrol, night vision goggles with recording capabilities so that they could record anything that they were seeing and send it to us, thermal binoculars, and some other things as well. And we also brought them more ammunition for their shotguns, 16 gauge shotguns.
Nice.
And I want to thank I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the gentleman from oh my God, this is terrible. I'm forgetting the name of the church. It'll pop in my mind at some point. There's a particular church in Nashville that I can't believe I forgot the name of the church, but Pastor Darren Tyler and some guys from his church helped us raise the funds to supply, donated, helped us. They contributed to helping me fund this expedition and supply the village. So we chartered the riverboat, brought the supplies to the villagers. We were received very warmly in the village, as is usually the case in Peru, if you know how to talk to them. And they received us very, very warmly. I was met by an army of guys with shotguns. By the way, all of this is documented on my YouTube channel. There's a video documents this whole thing. It's the featured video on my YouTube channel. It's called, I think, Alien Attack Expedition Report, something like that. It's a picture of me and Doug standing there with all the equipment we brought them, and like the villagers are behind us, and they wanted to take a picture with us, so we did.
That's cool.
So when we got there, the villagers, they actually did a little ceremony for us to welcome us. These are the Iquitu people, by the way, very, very old tribe. And so they did a dance for us and really received us very warmly. So then after that, we began our investigation in earnest. And I'm really bad at summarizing this because my brain wants to walk sequentially through this whole thing.
Oh, I get it.
I'm really, really bad. I'm long-winded. I am. I'm overly verbose. That's for sure. But I see this. I see the narrative, and I can't. It's hard for me to jump forward if I don't supply all the details. Nope. Anyway, I'll try and jump forward. When we began our investigation, we were conducting the investigation. We were walking around with the Apu, the chief of the village, and he was bringing us to all the various sites around the village where people had encountered these entities, and interviewing the villagers. And dozens and dozens of the people in the village had encountered the phenomenon directly. Some of them saw. Okay, so I'll just describe what they saw. The incursions would begin with people would see two like little flying saucers, or various little mini flying saucers flying around in the air above the village. No sound, just like little flying saucers. They had lights around the perimeter. They were like the size of, I don't know what to compare it to. Here's what I can compare it to. You remember those, if you're old enough, like me, you'll remember sometimes you'd see people sled riding with those circular sleds, those circles, okay. Remember? I don't know what those are called. They're like the circular sleds. They used to be popular, not so much anymore. There's something like that. So imagine people flying around on those things, discs, and they would see these discs flying around or hovering above their village. And then they would notice two discs would go fly over the jungle and descend and land. It turns out that these discs were hoverboards, hoverboard technology. They were circles. They were flying discs. And the villagers oftentimes saw people on the discs, and they would always go like this. Every time they described this to me, all of the villagers, they would go like this. Like they were surfing basically on these discs.
Yeah, like surfing on the air, trying to keep their balance.
Yeah, controlling the discs.
Right, okay.
And the discs were silent, and except for when they took off, when they lifted off the ground, there was like a compressed air sound, they told me. But, and they would always come 2 by 2 when they would make the incursions into the village. And so they would land the disc in the jungle, and then they would usually disembark from the disc, from the platforms. And they would silently, surreptitiously make their way into the village. And sometimes the villagers would catch them, and they would be creeping in, and they were dressed in stealth body armor, head to foot. Okay, so imagine the Green Goblin flying on his thing, except there was no noise, no propulsion system, and there were circles. And but just like the Green Goblin, who was dressed head to foot in our body armor, except his body armor was green. Yeah, very, very similar. To that. I mean, it really is very similar. Wow. These assailants, they had helmets, except they didn't have the big grinning face on the helmets like the Green Goblin, but they did have those almond-shaped eye lenses, and their helmets were elongated. Wow. So very, very reminiscent of the Green Goblin. Actually, it's like I keep saying, that's a really the comparison is apropos. So 2 of these guys at a time would stealthily enter the village. Sometimes they'd be caught coming in, and in one case, I think this was the first incursion. They walked me through this in the village. One individual saw these guys. He was out back, I think, taking a leak, and he saw these 2 guys creeping in. And so he happened to have his shotgun on him because he was guarding what's called the Tambo. The Tambo is a government building. It was a building that was built by the municipal government. It's a communications post. Okay. And they have internet there. So, in the evenings, people will be sitting around watching Marvel movies or whatever on their phones in the Tambo. It's this concrete building. Because they had satellite internet. And so there's a guard, and he had his shotgun, and he saw these 2 guys creeping in, and he walked me through this whole scenario where it happened. And he got close enough to these guys, and he shot them with his shotgun. Wow. And he hit one of them. And he heard the BBs dinging off some body armor, and the guy sort of leaned down and was checking his leg out. That was sort of like the first incursion. Wow. And then after that, almost every night, there were waves of incursions, or every other night, certainly every week. And these guys would come in 2 by 2 into the village, stealth body armor, head to foot. And now the villagers were having very close encounters, face to face, just a few feet away. And they would see these guys, shine their flashlight on them. Sometimes they would describe them as not walking but floating. And they all described this in the same way, same exact way. The assailants were wearing these boots that had circles on the bottom. Each boot had 2 circles on the bottom of it, and there was a light emitting from these circles. And so they could float, and about a meter off the ground. And in fact, in a couple of occasions, the villagers shot them with their shotguns at close proximity, and the assailants would get knocked back from the shotgun blast, but then pop right back up. Wow, completely unaffected. I mean, except for the fact that they were knocked back on their butt momentarily. Yeah. So the villagers realized these guys are bulletproof. So they started to take, because they were using 16 gauge birdshot. They started to take, open up the cartridge and to melt the BBs of the birdshot into slugs and then put them back in the cartridge. So they were making their own makeshift slugs because they realized the birdshot wasn't doing anything. But it turns out the slugs really weren't doing anything either. In fact, they were setting up traps around the perimeter of the village, 9 traps, they told me, which, without going into too much detail, the traps are just these like tubes with a cartridge in them and a mechanism, a hammer mechanism, and a string. So these are common traps in the jungle. Very, very dangerous. You trip the string and it discharges the cartridge, right? And they were elevating these traps so that they were, these assailants, by the way, were tall, unusually tall. All of the villagers said they were taller than me. And I'm 6'1". So, and when they said they were taller than me, I'd be like, how much taller? This much taller? This much taller? Yeah. They would all say a foot taller or more. Some people said like 2-3 feet taller than me. Wow. Exaggerating, probably, right? Probably exaggerating, but nevertheless, they're at least as tall as me, if not taller. And so the villagers, when they set these traps up, they position them so that they would be the height of their knees, what they estimated would be their knees, so that they could try and take them out at the knees, literally. And they would hear the traps going off at night, and they didn't catch any of them, but they would go out to check the traps, and they would see the footprints of the assailants. But rather than it being a boot footprint, it was these two circles, these two little circles next to each other with the outline of a boot, right? So there's some kind of levitation technology on the footwear. Yeah. Apart from the discs that they fly on. Right. And these assailants, most of the time they were dressed in like stealth black. But on one occasion, this one guy in the village, he swore to me, no, this dude was silver. Top to he was silver. He's like, I'm telling you, I have my flashlight right on him. Silver. And this is one of the guys that shot one of these dudes at close range and knocked him back on his butt. But most people told me they were stealth black, like matte black. Yeah. And it seems to be stealth technology. Like the body armor is really, really stealthy, not just black, something else going on. Like they could disappear almost, something like that. And they did have backpacks on, but they were like hard shell small backpacks. They weren't jet packs. Right. Now, I think some of the villagers, maybe when they described this to the police officers who came to investigate, the Peruvian police officers, I think some of the villagers were confused, thinking that, in their minds, there's got to be jet packs. Remember, these guys, this is the Iquitu people, right? But they're not uncivilized. They're not wearing grass skirts. They're not walking around naked or wearing grass skirts. These are civilized villagers. They watch all the same movies we do. They know what helicopters are. They know what aircraft is. They know what jetpacks are. They watch all the same Instagram reels that you all watch. So these are people who are very, very well informed. In that regard. And I think some of them did confuse the backpacks for jetpacks, but clearly they weren't. A lot of these guys were very specific. They were emphatic that the propulsion system was in the boots and on the discs. It's crazy. And so I surmised that the packs, because these are like little hard shell packs, that these are reactors or battery packs or something like that. Right. And clearly, when they would be described floating, it was always the boots. There was a light emanating from the bottom of the boots. That's every time they would describe that. It was the boots. So on one occasion, there's this 15-year-old girl named Talia who was in her backyard. And by the way, all the incursions would happen after dark. Always after dark. They blend in dark suits. This 15-year-old girl, she was out in her backyard at dusk. She was knocking down some fruit from a tree and to make a drink, and the fruit hits the ground. She bends over to pick it up, and she notices that she felt a wind at her back, and the leaves sort of rustled around. And she looked over, and I should say that in her backyard, she's in the middle of the village, or she's not on the very outskirts of the village. There's other houses around, right? Other dwellings are around their dwelling. But in between, there's like this gully, this forested gully. So there's jungle in there, and in her house, it dips down, and then when it climbs back up, there's other houses around, right? So when she bent over to pick up this fruit and she felt this breeze, she looked over and she saw one of these guys surfing on one of these platforms, and he flew up. That's where the wind was coming from. He flew up next to her, and he landed right behind her, and he landed his disc, and he grabbed her by the mouth, and he had a glove on. He grabbed her by the mouth and by the waist. So now she is securely in the arms of this guy, and but she saw another guy directly after fly up this hill on the platform, landed in front of her, and grabbed her feet. So now she's being held by these two guys. And then she described their body armor. It's actually pretty interesting. They had, armor on their chest, armor on their shoulders. There wasn't all hard. Like it was segmented.
Okay.
Like the Green Goblin.
Yeah.
Right. I keep referring to that because it's very accurate. And she said that, because I said, well, when they landed, they were on the discs. I said, when they took off, how did they do that? Did they activate any kind of like a mechanism? Did they press a button? Did they have anything in their hands? She said they didn't have anything in their hands, but after they grabbed her, they both reached down and pressed something on their boot to re-engage the technology to float off of the discs, right? So they re-engage the technology. Now they're floating, holding her, and they float her over to behind this little chicken coop, this thatch roof chicken coop behind her house. And they land, and remember, they got her by the mouth, and without going through all the details, it would take me 20 minutes to tell this story in great detail. They put some cream on her face. First, they shot something up her nose with a nasal syringe, and that made her feel disoriented. Then they smeared cream on her face. And she said that when they put the cream on her face went numb, instantly went numb. And she heard them talking in Spanish. One of them had a gringo accent, and the other one sounded like a Peruvian. And she said that one of them said to the other, be careful, don't put too much on, you're going to ruin the flesh. And she understood that as when they went to cut her face off, that it would make it harder if they put too much of this cream on. And then they took out what we think was a laser scalpel, and they began to make an incision under her neck. In fact, they made 2 incisions because they were too high, and then they went lower, or they were too low, and then they started going higher. And while they started to do this, it looks like a laser. While they started to do this, she reached behind her, and she started to push up the helmet of the guy holding her from behind. She was starting to lift up his helmet, and he sort of freaked out because he didn't want her to see his face.
Yeah.
And so the guy in front of her slapped her in the face. And during this commotion, they dropped her. And and when they momentarily lost control of her, and so she screamed. She let out one blood-curdling scream. And you have to remember, this wasn't the first incursion. So the villagers are already doing patrols. They're sitting on their front porches with their shotguns. So when they heard her scream and their flashlights, when they heard her scream, they were on scene pretty quick. Her brother and some other villagers who were in the vicinity, who had their homes were in the vicinity, they were on scene like in 30 seconds.
Wow.
And so after she screamed, one of the assailants said, let's go. We have to get out of here. And the other one said, no, we can't just leave her here. And he grabbed her by the hair and was dragging her, flying on his disc, dragging her up the hill. But like as if they wanted to lift her up by her hair, but the villagers were on scene too quick, so they let her go. And when the villagers got there, they told me what they saw, unsurprisingly, were 2 guys surfing on discs.
Yeah.
And they saw Talia laying on the ground. Blood on her face. And the 2 guys on the discs, when the villagers approached them, they just shot up into the sky.
Really?
Up through the trees.
Wow.
So, this is an incident this was a testimony of Talia and her brother and other villagers who were there. And so Talia, I didn't mention this, but when we interviewed Talia, we went into the village in the evening one evening. We were in the village 2 or 3 days, I can't remember. Definitely 3 nights. And when we went into the village one evening, specifically wanting to talk to Talia, everybody in these jungle villages in the evening, all the men are playing soccer, all the women are playing volleyball. And the rest of everyone else is just sort of sitting around watching, and it's a very relaxing scene. And so they do this in the center of the village, usually in the plaza. And so we were walking through the plaza, and we approached the Apu, the chief, who's a young man named Jairo Reatigu. I probably got that wrong. And his first name is Jairo for sure.
Yeah.
And Reatigi, I think, is his last name. It's a native. It's a Iquitu name. And we asked him, we told him we'd like to interview Talia. And it just so happens that Talia was sitting over against the wall of a hut watching the people play volleyball and soccer. And she had a smile on her face. She was sitting by herself on a bench against the wall. And he said, "There's Talia right there." And he said, you guys can go and talk to her if you like, but let me go get her father first. And, her father can go and let her know you'd like to talk to her. So as he's going and fetching her father, Talia is just sitting there with kind of a smile on her face, enjoying herself. She looks over and she sees me and Doug. And me and Doug are pretty imposing figures. I'm 6'1". Doug's a big guy. He's shorter than me, but he's a power lifter. He's a big guy. Gotcha. And she looks over at us and immediately starts to tremble. She looks over and she starts to tremble. She's like in shock. And she starts trembling, and she takes her hair, her long hair, and she moves it over to the side of her face so we can't see her face. And she's just sitting there trembling, obviously severe PTSD.
Right.
And her father goes over to her and says, these gentlemen would like to talk to you. And she refused. She did not. She was crying, and he came over to us and he said, "I'm sorry. She's very upset. She's crying. She's trembling. She's associating you guys with her assailants."
Yeah, right.
And he said she has he didn't say PTSD. He did later. He actually gave me documents they took her down to a psychiatrist. No, they took her down to a medical post, because San Antonio de Pinto Yacu doesn't have a good medical facility, but a village over has a better medical facility. So they took her there, and they diagnosed her with severe PTSD, and he had the paperwork. And by the way, we sent her to a psychiatrist in the city of Iquitos to get treated, because she was really in bad shape. Our hearts broke for this girl. And anyway, her dad just told us she does not want to talk to you. He said, "But come to our house tomorrow morning and just show up after, come in the morning, and I'll talk to her and I'll bring her to you, and I'll give me time to talk to her, to let her know that you guys are not the bad guys and you're trying to help us," and so forth. So that's how we ended up talking to Talia. But that was our encounter with her. When she came out, when her father brought her out the next morning, when she was standing in front of me, she was trembling and crying.
Wow. Just at the sight, because you guys reminded her of.
Yeah. Yep. And so, anyway, that's what happened to Talia. And there's a lot of other things I could say about this, but I don't want to just drone on for hours. People can go watch a video on my YouTube channel for all the details. But apart from the hover, from the hover disk technology, there were also advanced aerospace vehicles involved, because many of the villagers saw a craft that they described it. Look, they drew and I have it in the video. Several of them drew it in the dirt for me. They all drew the exact same thing. It was kind of like a triangle shape, but rounded. And the way they described it was an acorn, like an acorn on its side. Okay. And in fact, there's a scene in the video where this guy draws it on an acrylic chalkboard for me, and I film it. And he describes the craft in great detail, because he had a close encounter with it one night, pulling up his nets. And some of them said that the body of the craft that he saw was translucent. In other words, it looked like mesh, like a screen door, like mesh. But he could see the shape of the craft, and he could see two bundles or people inside of it, in which he interpreted as two guys sitting at chairs, in seats, one in the front, one in the middle. And he described the craft, the various lights and so forth. and many people in the village saw these craft, but he was the only one who said he saw it translucent. The others, when they saw it, it was just dark and hovering, like it had dark body armor type, like matte black, not body armor, but like, you know, like that matte black type coating on it.
Yeah.
And it just hovered about 40 feet above the village, and multiple people saw this thing. Again, they all drew it for me, described it the exact same way. So there's advanced aerospace vehicles involved in this phenomenon. That's why the jetpack miner, the jetpack miner theory is really so retarded. You know, everybody invoking this. How many of these people have ever encountered river miners? I have.
Yeah. And
believe me, they don't have anything that we would even describe as advanced technology, let alone modern technology. They're floating around on these rusted out metal boats and dumping a bunch of mercury in the water and trudging the bottom of the river, killing all the fish in there, and it's just terrible what they do. And these are criminals, and they're not sophisticated. Believe me.
Right.
So they're dangerous. They're armed with shotguns and pistols, but they're not sophisticated.
They're not what you guys saw. Just incredible. I mean, to say the least. How did it end up? I mean, once it was all said and done, how did it end up?
We on the final night we were there, I had a couple of I had employed a couple of Navy commandos who happen to be jungle survival experts. They taught the jungle survival courses for the Navy. And by the way, I was able to contract these guys for the most famous admiral in Peru.
Oh, wow.
I sat down with him in Lima, and I contracted these guys through him. And I took them with me just because I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know if this was cartel, you know, initially. I didn't know what I was going to find. So we brought these guys for some additional security. But me and Doug, by the way, was a Marine. He was an infantry Marine, and he's a firearms trainer today. And so Doug and these two Navy guys and myself, I was just translating for Doug in this scene, which again I filmed. It was in the video. They trained the villagers, the men. We had all the men come together in the Tambo, in that building, that concrete building, one evening on the last night, and we went over some things with them. I talked to them about what we had discovered, what our thoughts were, and then we trained them in how to use the technology. We brought the high-powered flashlights, the radios, the night vision goggles, and the thermal binoculars. We trained them how to use the technology. And then Doug and the Navy guys trained them in how to walk patrols, how to conduct proper patrols. Because these guys were waving their shotguns around willy-nilly. I mean, I had so many shotguns pointed at my head when I first walked into this village, not intentionally, unintentionally.
Right.
So Doug and the Navy guys, first and foremost, told them how to carry a loaded firearm.
Right.
And so they ended up shooting each other. And then how to walk patrols. So if you see something, everyone's not aiming shotguns at each other, right? That everybody aims the shotgun in the same direction at the same time. They form a line, and then they all train their shotguns in the same direction. Doug showed them how to, and the Navy guys showed them how to do these patrols, and it was cool. We were walking around the building. It was raining. It was night, and they were practicing the patrol. And then Doug and the Navy guys supervised. We were sitting we were sleeping, and our lodging was on the riverboat docked against the bank where the village was. That was our quarters, right? And so we would be sitting in the riverboat with a couple walkie-talkies and observing with binoculars, observing these guys walking the patrol, just like we showed them, just like Doug and the Navy guys taught them. It was really remarkable. I mean, they picked it up immediately. They were walking these patrols. They were communicating with Doug divided the village into zones for them. And so they were communicating, this is zone 1, nothing to report in zone 1. This is zone 2, whatever. It was really quite remarkable. They picked it up very, very quickly, and they were very serious about it, and they were extremely grateful. And and so kudos to Doug and the Navy guys for their expertise in training those guys. So they were trained. They were ready. They were better trained to defend their village, and they had night vision recording capabilities to record the phenomenon.
Right. Exactly.
And in fact, there was a tower, I forget what it was, some kind of a tower built for something that you could climb up into, and they were positioning somebody in that tower with the night vision goggles. So they were ready.
Yeah.
They were ready to record the phenomenon, but it never happened again.
How about that?
So by the time we got there in October of 2023, they had only had a couple of incursions since the cessation of the incidents in the beginning of August and the time when we showed up in October. There had been a couple of incursions, but by the time we got there, the phenomenon had basically subsided. And then after we left, I maintained communication periodically with the village. They haven't had any more incursions.
Interesting.
People always say, "What's the update?" Well, there is no update. They haven't had any incursion, nothing to report.
Right, exactly. So I guess all in all, Tim, looking back on all that, what do you think ultimately we were dealing with there? I mean, was this special operation some type of clandestine CIA type thing, or?
I really don't have time to go into the details of the Nauta. There's an incident in the city of Nauta that we investigated, which was really, really fascinating. And the reason why I invoke Nauta is because people were saying, and will say to this day, that, these were river miners with jetpacks, and they wanted to scare the people, drive them out of their land so that they could mine the river for gold. Well, and the idea is that these are soft targets out in the middle of nowhere, and that the jetpack, the miners were putting, sheets on drones to try and scare the people, making them think they're ghosts. Has that happened? Sure, that's happened in the past, but that's not what this was. And the proof, the definitive proof that that's not what we're dealing with is the fact that these incursions were also happening, or at least these assailants were also being seen around the city of Nauta, 36,000 inhabitants. This is a hardened target. There's a police force. There's an army presence with helicopters, and there's a Navy base with Navy boats. This is not a soft target.
Right.
And the same phenomenon was being seen in Nauta.
Incredible.
So bye-bye to the idea of these are trying to drive these hapless villagers off of their land. No, because the same stuff was happening in Nauta. In fact, outside of Nauta, there's a village called Bagasan, not far from Nauta, and a boy was attacked. And this young boy, same kind of assailants, dressed in the same body armor, flying on discs, same deal. They attacked this boy, and they had successfully cut into on both sides, cut under his jaw as if they're going to take his face off. But the boy was rescued. I don't remember what the exact circumstances were to his rescue. The boy was rescued. And he was, when he was rescued, he was rushed to the hospital because he had these deep lacerations under his neck.
Yeah.
And he looked like gills. I mean, he looked like a fish with gills.
Jeez. And
it was very gory, and it was on Peruvian TV. I put it in one of my videos. It was on Peruvian TV. They show everything in Peru. They don't bother to blur much over there. And the boy's just sitting there in the hospital in shock, bleeding from his neck, and thankfully they were able to sew him up and give him blood and save his life.
My goodness gracious.
So these incursions were happening all over the place. I could talk for 2 more hours about this, but unfortunately I'm out of time. But people can refer to my videos about this on my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Timothy Alberino. Watch out. There are some imposter accounts out there. Mine should be apparent. You'll see my featured video is our report on this on my YouTube channel. So if you want all the details and the video, the footage of us out there doing this investigation, then I would refer you to that YouTube video.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just on your way out here, Tim, just I guess, short answer, since we've been at this for a while now for you, and I appreciate that. I really do. what was your final assessment? Extraterrestrial, human? What kind of?
Oh yeah, I didn't answer your question.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, so I was illustrating. I was bringing up those additional details to make my point about that, which is I think that we're looking at human beings, nefarious human beings in possession of advanced technology, including aerospace technology. What's the purpose? What are they doing? Who knows? I suspect they're using the face peeler legend as cover for something else. And I should remark at the very end here, there was a joint military operation happening in Peru called Resolute Sentinel, involving almost every branch of the United States military, also including the Coast Guard. The Space Force was there in Peru. And it was the Peruvian equivalent branches of the military were involved. So was Brazil. So was Uruguay. I believe Ecuador was involved. The United Kingdom was involved. There were a handful of different countries. This was an quote unquote exercise, right? Military exercise happening. Just so happens that the end of this exercise, these exercises overlapped with the face peeler incursions. So is there something to that? Was Resolute Sentinel a cover? Was it being used as a cover for some other operation that was being run in the Peruvian jungle? Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States military were the perpetrators, but what if they were hunting the perpetrators? What if this was like a predator scenario and the Resolute Sentinel operation was being used as a cover for a real operation in which we had special forces guys in the Peruvian Amazon trying to weed something out? Or, some people like to say, no, though they were testing technology on the villagers. I don't like to think about that. So, I mean, I can't totally rule that out, but I would lean more in the direction of a rogue aerospace contractor or a contractor of an aerospace contractor that's gone rogue and is testing technology or actually harvesting faces. Look, if they're harvesting faces, if that's what the op was, they really suck at their job because they only got a couple.
Yeah.
There were a couple of cases where people did have their faces removed.
Wow.
During this flap, at least one in particular that I'm aware of that was confirmed to me by the villagers of San Antonio de Pintuyacu. It was a young man, but for the most part, they were making dozens and dozens and dozens of incursions and only got a couple of faces. That sounds like a cover for something to me. That sounds like they wanted the villagers to think that this was the face peelers were here to cover for something else that they were doing in the jungle. Now, were they abducting people? Maybe. Again, it wasn't limited to San Antonio de Pintuyacu. There were other villages that were being attacked.
Right.
And not just in Alto Nanay. There were villages being attacked outside of the city of Tarapoto, where 2 of my children were born. Wow. In the Peruvian Amazon. So it was fairly widespread. And if they were there to harvest faces, like I said, they had all the technology, all the stealth technology, and they only got a couple of faces. That doesn't seem like it was the purpose of the operation. Something else was going on, in my estimation. Now, could it have been, and this is wild speculation, but could it have been human and non-human? Maybe a co-op of some kind? Maybe. And I have some reasons that, that why I think that could be. Maybe. I'm not convinced that that's true, but maybe. The possibility exists. We don't have time to go through that, but people can refer to my video on my YouTube channel where I talk about it.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, Tim, this is what I'm thinking about right now is good luck to me writing up the tease for this episode, because it is going to be, I mean, this whole thing has been incredible to go over all the topics that we've covered. And believe it or not, I could cover even more with you, but we'll put some things on the shelf for now. And hopefully I can have you back on another time if you don't mind.
Yeah. We haven't even talked about the Boogosphere.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yes. I mean, I was going to get into Vatican and demonic possession and all these different things. And so we'll have to shelve.
Yeah, I've got other interesting projects I'm doing. Some on my own. I'm joining some other operations that are happening. They're UFO related in South America. I can't say more than that, but always ongoing. I'm always got something cooking, some expedition cooking. That's what I like to do. I like to do field investigation, and people can follow me. By the way, if you want to follow along, I do events too, conferences and other kinds of events as well that people might be interested in. And above all, I have a members community. So I go, I reveal a lot more in my members community just because it's not public. It's a subscription community. and we talk about all kinds of things in that community. We do deep dives into different books, including my own book, Birthright. And if people are interested in that, they can sign up at the alberinoanalysis.com, and follow me on social media, on X and on Instagram. I don't currently have a Facebook page, although everyone tells me I need one. So, but again, the videos on the Face Peeler stuff are on YouTube, for those who are interested. But yeah, I'm always involved in some kind of an expedition. So people can track with me if they want.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought all that up and where people can find you, look for the books, look at what you're doing now, look at the work you have coming up in different conferences. So I'm glad you put all that out before we were done, because I was just about to ask you to do it. So you read my mind. Timothy Alberino, again, really appreciate it. I'm glad we got to do this. It's something I've been looking forward to doing for a while, to sit down and talk with you about all these subjects and topics. And hopefully we can stay in touch and catch up again soon to talk about even more.
Certainly. Thank you, sir, for having me on your show.
My pleasure. Timothy Alberino, thanks so much right here on UAP.